was a scam. The media perpetuated and magnified the lie.
But then you would turn on the news, you would see these kind of like softball coverage.
And Mark Owens definitely not a scam.
That doesn't make it a scam.
Investors are really investing in a media company that's selling the story.
It's an innocent lie that makes life on Earth more magical, like Santa Claus. Basics to life. Basically, yes.
And then, of course, Mars, becoming a multi-planet species. Seems to help out being a single-planet species.
I suspect people believe Mars is a good place to colonize because of a sort of historical residue left over from a time in which we believed Mars truly was Earth-like. You know, there was a time, mostly in the 18th century, when we thought the moon was another planet like Earth, which is why they named the darker spots on the moon Maria, Latin for seas. But there were few to no works of science fiction, at least in the form we know today, to shape the public's general perception of the moon. Literature and other contemporary works of art centered around the distant and mysterious Orient, or American West, areas as alien and captivating to 18th century Europeans as Mars is today to 21st century Earthlings. But by the late 19th century, mass media had emerged and space was all the rage, giving rise to early works of science fiction. At the same time, observations of Mars revealed clouds and potentially water-filled canals. For half a century, Mars became the most popular extraterrestrial location in fiction, and instilled into the general public the idea that Mars is an Earth-like habitable planet. So the purpose of this video is to clear the residually built-up 20th century gunk out of the perceptive arteries of our modern coagulated cholesterol-ridden collective consciousness. I'm Ian Long, and this is Anthrofuturism. You can't breathe on Mars, and it's also radioactive, and the soil is toxic, and it's about as cold as Antarctica, meaning all the protections you need on the moon, you also need on Mars. So, in fact, it's not easier to live on than the moon. It's basically just as hard. Then you add in that it's also 200 times further away from the Earth than the moon, which makes everything more expensive, and as Antarctica, meaning all the protections you need on the moon, you also need on Mars. So, in fact, it's not easier to live on than the moon. It's basically just as hard. Then you add in that it's also 200 times further away from the Earth than the moon, which makes everything more expensive and take longer. And for what? An atmosphere 1% as strong as Earth's that massively complicates launching and landing operations while providing basically no beneficial protection? Or 1/3 the gravity of Earth? If we want low gravity, the moon has less. If you need gravity to maintain bone and muscle atrophy in space but don't want to exercise, sit and spin. Centrifugal forces will do the rest. Or perhaps some rare minerals we don't have here on Earth. Well, as far as we know, Mars doesn't have any rare minerals, and in fact has far fewer minerals than both the Earth and Moon, which both have around 6,000 minerals, while Mars has a measly 161. Not to mention all the asteroids that are much closer and easier to mine than Mars. Now I know what you might be thinking. Ian, you don't understand. It's not all about economic gain, you psycho-capitalist. It's about expanding civilization's presence off-world, so we don't have all our eggs, pets, children, friends, families, forests, oceans, and taxonomic trees in one basket. Well, anticipated commenter, I agree. This is a very worthy endeavor, but it's my contention that we're better off planting the seeds of continuity on the equally harsh, but much closer, moon. The moon is not a nice place. You don't go there for its nice beaches, but it is valuable in the same way a port or warehouse is valuable. It is utilitarian. What does the moon have that we don't have here on Earth? Nothing. Everything the moon has, the Earth has more of. The moon has the same metals and minerals, the same basic crust composition, but it's smaller, so there's actually less of everything. The only thing the moon has that the Earth lacks is a few rare isotopes created by the solar wind that Earth's magnetosphere blocks, namely helium-3, which isn't useful until we're using full-scale fusion reactors in a decade or 2, or 3, or 10. But it's precisely what the moon doesn't have that makes it useful. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere, and it doesn't have much gravity, making it an ideal location to launch missions to other celestial bodies from, and for manufacturing goods to be shipped to Earth or elsewhere. According to the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, velocity change, or delta V, from the moon's surface to low Earth orbit is 6.4. Delta V from the Earth's surface to low Earth orbit is 9.3 to 10. In other words, it's easier to get into orbit around the Earth if you start from the moon than if you start from the Earth's surface itself. Also, shipping anything from the moon to the Earth's surface takes less time than shipping things across an Earth ocean. Are you paying attention, Amazon? South Africa to China shipping typically takes 30 to 40 days without delays, and shipments have to arrive in a designated port with all the necessary coastal infrastructure. Anything shipped from the moon can land literally anywhere on Earth by adjusting the descent trajectory. Once a shipment enters the Earth's atmosphere, aerobraking, or parachutes, will do all the work. This means inland hubs can be set up outside of every major city. Imagine landing tonnage outside a remote town in the middle of Wyoming or Alaska, or near any industrial center, significantly reducing the need to truck things across continents. Because the moon's crust is so similar to Earth's, it has most resources that would be needed as feedstock for product production. However, it lacks hydrocarbons, so aside from 3D printers, mass-producing plastic products, lunar side will never make economic sense. But steel, aluminum, cobalt, you name it, all industries can be moved off-world, cutting down on pollution and travel time. The moon has a dark side, which is ideal for telescopes. On Earth, freezing cold vacuums are very useful for many scientific experiments and sensitive instruments, and even many manufacturing techniques, but inducing these conditions on this warm, wet planet can be very expensive. On the moon, it's free. Look, the list goes on, but I think you get the point. The moon has all the alien advantages of being in space, while also having many of the useful aspects of Earth, and it just so happens to be the closest celestial body to us, easiest to reach. If in some alternate reality, Earth didn't have the moon, assuming complex life could even form without it, or it was too small to be of any use, or maybe the moon happened to have a dense atmosphere and stronger gravity, like the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, Titan, Io, and Callisto, then the establishment of a space economy would be much more expensive, the timeframes of becoming a spacefaring civilization much longer. Lacking a giant floating warehouse full of resources, we'd instead need to build large, expensive, resource-intensive orbital stations. Where would we get the resources to do this? Considering one of the steps to being able to build larger, scaled-up space stations in our moon-loving reality is the development of the moon, from which we'll derive such resources, I imagine a civilization less fortunate would have a barrier of entry large enough that they may never pass the next great filter. This body to us, easiest to reach. If in some alternate reality, Earth didn't have the moon, assuming complex life could even form without it, or it was too small to be of any use, or maybe the moon happened to have a dense atmosphere and stronger gravity, like the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, Titan, Io, and Callisto, then the establishment of a space economy would be much more expensive, the timeframes of becoming a spacefaring civilization much longer. Lacking a giant floating warehouse full of resources, we'd instead need to build large, expensive, resource-intensive orbital stations. Where would we get the resources to do this? Considering one of the steps to being able to build larger, scaled-up space stations in our moon-loving reality is the development of the moon, from which we'll derive such resources, I imagine a civilization less fortunate would have a barrier of entry large enough that they may never pass the next great filter and be confined to their birth planet forever. The only evidence they ever existed would be a few beaten up space probes lost and forgotten somewhere between the stars. So we're actually very fortunate to have the moon as our player's starting companion. It's like we started the game on easy mode. Essentially what I'm saying is we're the planetary equivalent of a trust fund kid. We could have gotten any moon, but we got the moon. Now, what does Mars offer us? Nice beaches? No, it's basically Utah without all the charming Mormons and national parks. The number one thing Mars has to offer humans?
Knowledge.
It has immense research value. This is great, and it's time we admit that it is enough. Quit trying to force Mars to be something it's not. The bottom line is that the moon has much more material and utilitarian value than Mars. And as far as all those existential reasons people want to colonize Mars go, well, they also work on the moon. Okay, but what about once the moon is developed? Then we should go to Mars, right? Well, no. The next step is giant starships, space freighters, and orbital stations. If we can imagine a future in which humanity is traversing the solar system, most of those ships would have been built in a shipyard orbiting Luna. Once we humans have freed ourselves from our earthly shackles and are traversing the heavens, why should we seek out new planetary chains? Why should we venture to return back to squabbling in rusty perchlorate-filled dirt? In all honesty, Mars might be one of the last places you want to touch in the solar system, in the same league as Mercury or the Taco Bell bathroom. But that didn't stop defunct Mars colonization firm, Mars One, from raising $928,888 in donations and sales. Thanks for watching, and if you want a more in-depth look at developing the moon, I recommend checking out this book some random dude wrote on Amazon. I heard it's alright. Colonization firm, Mars One, from raising $928,888 in donations and sales. Thanks for watching, and if you want a more in-depth look at developing the moon, I recommend checking
As telescopes like the James Webb look out across the Milky Way, you might have heard the growing buzz around newly discovered exoplanets. It wasn't that long ago, only 1992, that we found the first planet outside our solar system. But since then, over 5,500 have been confirmed in the relatively small area of space, only a few thousand light years across, that we reside in. When the Milky Way itself is roughly 100,000 light years in diameter, this offers us a tantalizing promise of billions to trillions more across the rest of our galaxy. Every star, on average, likely has at least one planet, and perhaps has several. With all of these exoplanets out there just waiting to be found, it's only natural we would want to turn our thoughts towards Goldilocks zones and planet habitability. After all, humanity has its eye on colonizing the stars, and an Earth 2.0 is surely waiting for us out there, mathematically speaking. In fact, you might have already heard that phrase, Earth 2.0, being delivered in headlines of articles or videos claiming that a planet has been discovered that would be ideal for human life and colonization. However, don't believe the hype. All the planets we found so far have, to put it scientifically, sucked. And once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you'll agree that moving to any of them will be the last thing any sane person would want to do. I'm Alex McColgan, and you're watching Astrum. Join with me today as I give you the grand real estate tour on the potential Earth 2.0s we've discovered so far, and explain why right now is the wrong time to get onto the planetary property ladder. When choosing an Earth 2.0, just like with building a house, it's a good idea to start by establishing your non-negotiables. Some of this is fairly simple to consider. For instance, temperature. You want a nice, temperate climate, somewhere that's not too warm and not too cold. Given that temperature drops the further you are from the sun, every planetary system has a sweet spot where the temperature of a planet is likely just right, not too hot and not too cold, similar to Goldilocks and her bowls of stolen porridge. As a rough rule of thumb, if a planet is at the right distance from a star, it may well have a suitable temperature for us to set up shop. Of course, this is in no way a guarantee. After all, Venus, a planet residing in this zone, in theory should be perfect, but its choking atmosphere makes it the hottest planet in our solar system in spite of its relative distance from the sun compared with Mercury. So it's clear, atmosphere also plays a part in all this. Speaking of atmosphere, that's also something you'll want to look for on Earth 2.0. Ideally something with oxygen and water vapor, and without anything that would poison us, but at least something that could trap heat in and offer some protection from space radiation. However, sometimes a non-negotiable is simply the neighbors that live close by. So let's consider the first major reason why most of the galaxy's exoplanets fall short: their neighboring stars. Our own star is known as a G-type yellow dwarf, a relatively fast-burning, short-lived sort of star, at least compared to some of the other options out there. Stars like our sun tend to live for 10 billion years before their cores collapse and they transform into a red giant. It is stable, and that stability has been useful for the life that eventually flourished here. However, yellow dwarfs are far from common in the Milky Way. They represent only 10% of the total stars. Far more common in occurrence are the long-lived red dwarfs, which make up 75% of the stars in our galaxy and can live for around 14 trillion years, longer than our universe has existed, which means we've never seen one die, so to speak. And unfortunately for the planets orbiting them, red dwarfs come with numerous drawbacks. For starters, red dwarfs have a much closer Goldilocks zone compared to their yellow cousins. They burn less brightly, with luminosities between 10% and a measly 0.0125% that of our suns. So unless you want to live on a world shrouded in perpetual night, which sounds cold and depressing to me and will make growing